So are there any questions from the media on the issues that I've been here to announce today, and it's been my pleasure to do? I'll take that as a ringing endorsement from the media. Great. I have no intention of changing the way we go about managing issues on our border and the running of that operation because it has been so successful. I know plenty of people would like me to. I know the people smugglers would like me to change how we do things on our borders, and we won't be.
Does this incident prove that the boats have not stopped?
There's not been a successful people smuggling maritime venture to Australia in more than 6 months, and that's as true today as it was yesterday, and it's our intention it'll be true tomorrow.
Will these asylum seekers face prosecution in Sri Lanka just by seeking asylum?
Well, you've made a presumption in your question that I can't comment on.
Will any of the asylum seekers be handed to the Sri Lankan Navy, and if so, when?
Again, you're making presumptions about instances that I can't comment on.
Can you say that there were no Tamil asylum seekers who were handed over to Navy personnel from Sri Lanka?
Well, operations that relate to Operation Sovereign Borders are subject to the policies that I've outlined. Now, we have been crystal clear about that from the beginning. I've made it clear that ventures that may seek to come will be subject to the policies that we have in place. And the government is continuing to set about implementing those policies on a daily basis. And where there are matters that require reporting consistent with the way we've done that in the past, I've done that on every occasion. Matters of safety of life at sea, matters of medical transfers. These are the things that we've reported on in due course. And that is, I think, the confidence the Australian people can have, is that if there are matters relating to things of that nature, then I would have reported on those matters. The government is not changing its policy on our borders. I need to make that very clear. I know the Greens and Labor advocates and others want us to change what we're doing on our borders, and I'm sure if the Greens and Labor were back in power, they would be changing things. They would be rolling over. But the government, frankly, is not going to be intimidated out of changing our policies on our borders.
Are immigration officials screening asylum seekers at sea?
The Australian government, in our undertakings and what we do as part of Operation Sovereign Borders, is always cognizant of our international obligations and the relevant conventions as they apply, and we always act in accordance with those obligations.
Does that mean screening at sea would
It means
not
exactly
be
what I just said.
So what's your legal advice on that? Because I know previously the department's been told that's potentially unlawful.
Well, again, you're making presumptions about circumstances and things that happened under previous governments, and I couldn't tell you what legal advice has been put to previous governments and the circumstances in which advice had been provided. So I don't think you can make the leap about advice, frankly.
But is that your advice now? Is that your legal
advice? The government,
now?
neither this government or previous governments ever comment on internal legal advice they may or may not have received.
If this hasn't happened, why just not say that it hasn't happened?
The government's policy on Operation Sovereign Borders has been crystal clear, and I really don't understand the surprise that I see on some of the faces. We are doing what we said we would do. We are doing it in the way we said we would do it. And specifically on this issue of communication, it is exactly as I indicated things would be done before the election. I said before the election that the communications policies on Operation Sovereign Borders would be determined by the commander of the Joint Agency Task Force. That is what has happened, and that is what we have complied with from day one. Now, that is the practice we're going to continue, and I can understand that there is significant interest in this, but the public interest in this, from my perspective as Minister, is the national interest. And the national interest is this government does not budge when it comes to border protection. We made a commitment to the Australian people that we were going to stop the boats, and that is exactly what we are doing. If the government were to bow in the face of what other form of pressure that is seeking to be applied on this matter, then I think the Australian people would have every right to feel dudded. They're not going to be dudded by this government because we mean what we say and we say what we mean when it comes to our borders.
Do you regard it as unfortunate that the Sri Lankan Navy doesn't adopt the same approach and that they have made comments about or claims about things having happened?
Sri Lanka is a sovereign country and they're at liberty to discuss matters as they see fit. I'm here as Minister of an Australian government and I address the matters in accordance with our policies.
Have these Tamil asylum seekers had access to legal representation, do you know?
Well, again, presumptions in questions that speculate on matters that I have not confirmed or provided any comment on.
Are you concerned that those Tamil asylum seekers could be harmed when they're returned, and the government could therefore be breaking the international law of non-refoulement?
I refer to my previous answers and say again that the government acts in accordance with our international obligations, in accordance with the conventions that are appropriate to any circumstances that may present.
Would you say that the boats have all been stopped then?
I can tell you that there has not been a single successful maritime people smuggling venture to Australia since the 19th of December. Now, this is something that will go on into the future. I have always said that we are prepared for ventures that may seek to make it to Australia. And I think the minute you let your guard down, the minute you change your policy, the minute that a government might seek to walk away from the commitments it made in this area, that will be the best day that people smugglers have had since Kevin Rudd was elected in 2007. And that's not going to happen on this government's watch. But I think the Australian people have got a very clear read on how this situation would be different if it was a Labor minister standing here in front of you today. They would have wilted under the pressure and they would have allowed border protection policy to be compromised. Not happening on my watch.
Minister, the human rights groups have said they're contacting the UN about this. Have you been talking to the UN about Australia's international obligations? Is that a dialogue you have?
Well, if any,
regularly?
to the extent any processes are initiated, then we would comply with the processes as any government would be required to do.
Have they raised concern?
Well, I'm saying if there were processes, we would be responding to them, and you might know that if such processes were initiated, then they're done in the first instance at a direct level, and if there are further steps that are taken under those international proceedings. But at this stage, these matters are very early, I would suggest, and I haven't had no direct approach about these matters from anyone at this point. But again, the matters which you refer to are matters that have been reported in other places, and the government's policies are as I've outlined them, and that's what applies.
It's monsoon season at the moment. Are you satisfied that lives are not being put at risk by processes that the Australian government is?
I have total confidence in the men and women of our Border Protection Command and the Australian Navy and the Australian Customs and Border Protection who serve under Border Protection Command. Safety of life at sea has always been their first duty. And can I remind you, since our policies, particularly those of turnbacks, were introduced late last year, there has not been the loss of a single life at sea. Not a single life. Now, that is in stark contrast to the almost 1,200 people who drowned at sea during the term of the previous government under those policies. That is not something this government intends to return to by following the approach of appeasement of people smugglers and compromising of our policies that the Greens and Labor are urging us to do.
The Prime Minister says Sri Lanka is a quote, peaceful country. Do you agree with that?
I do.
Where is that boat carrying 153 asylum seekers?
I refer to my previous answers.
Is it right that Australian-born infant children of asylum seekers are being sent from detention centres in South Australia to Christmas Island? If you're referring to the case which I think you're referring to, my understanding is they're being transferred to Darwin at this point. But I'd make this point, that people are, and young children are transferred back to Christmas Island when there are medical clearances to do so. And I note that they are being transferred back to Christmas Island. So people who have arrived under previous arrangements would be at Christmas Island. If there was a medical reason for them to be transferred to Australia, then that would be done, to the mainland I should stress. And then when a medical clearance is provided for people to return to Christmas Island, then that's what happens. It's a medical clearance, and people are where the policy sets out for them to be, and if there's a departure for that for medical reasons, then that exception is made, and when the medical situation is at a point where people can return, then they do. That is standard practice and has been for a long time.
I understand you'll be visiting 2 detention centres in Melbourne tomorrow. What will you be doing there?
Well, I don't comment on my forward program.
You don't have any idea what you'll be doing?
No, I said I don't comment on my forward program. Okay, thanks for your time.
And that is the Immigration Minister Scott Morrison once again saying that he's not going to be making any comment about reports of asylum seekers, whether there are Tamil asylum seekers on a boat somewhere, whether they're about to be transferred to the Sri Lankan Navy. No comment from the Minister on that.
Yeah, there was one interesting question. It was asked whether are asylum seekers being screened at sea. He didn't say yes or no to that, but he did say the government was acting in accordance with international law. So that's where that was left, I think.